Hello and welcome to The Bottom Line here on TVP World, where we break down some of the main economic and business stories of the day. I'm your host, Marie Cato. 123 billion euros. That's how much money the European Commission has allocated for Poland in the outline of the next 7-year EU budget. Although the politicians in Warsaw are cheering that the figure is higher than what Poland receives under the current budget, it's also tentative and subject to further negotiations. Jan Kennedy has more.
After announcing a record-breaking €2 trillion budget, the European Commission has now revealed how these funds will be divided among EU member states. And once again, Poland has emerged as the biggest beneficiary, a development warmly welcomed by the country's Minister for the European Union, Adam Szłapka.
The starting point for discussions is a good one. The priorities are also important from our perspective because for the first time we are placing such strong emphasis on security and defense. At the same time, areas that have always been crucial for Poland, like the cohesion policy and common agricultural policy, are also prominently featured.
For the time being, Poland is set to receive 123 billion euros. Out of other CE members, Romania is set to receive a sizable 60 billion, Hungary 37 billion, while the Czech Republic and Slovakia 29 and 19 billion respectively. The final budget, however, must be approved unanimously by all 27 member states. And judging by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's comments, reaching a consensus will not be easy.
In my view, this budget won't even survive the next year. Either the Commission will have to dramatically retract it, or they'll have to step back gradually and rewrite it based on the reactions of the member states. This is what I see. Simply put, European countries will not accept this budget of the Brussels bureaucracy.
Funding for agriculture, which has been slashed by around 30%, sparking protests among farmers, has emerged as the biggest point of contention. They argue that due to inflation alone, they should be receiving nearly double the proposed amount.
Say no to the single fund of the CAP. This is why we are going to say no to less money to the farmers, because we want to maintain the actual amount of the money. We are going also to ask more money just for the inflation, not just for guarantees a fair income for farmers, but just to guarantee the European citizens about the food security.
And given the recent turbulence in the EU agricultural sector, approving such cuts will not be considered a popular move.
We saw a lot of tension in the agricultural sector throughout the last 2 or 3 years after the entrance of Ukraine to the single market after the war, and the goods coming from Ukraine, and the additional tensions if those same businesses, those same farmers are not receiving the same amount of money that they were in the previous years. It means that, this could be very problematic for the governments that will support this.
However, with several net contributor states already opposing the proposed funding level, increasing the budget will be a challenge.
Part of the reaction of the Parliament yesterday was to say it's not enough, we want to spend more, whereas the member states collectively will be saying we want to spend less. So that's where the real battle will come over.
Ahead lie 2 years of intense negotiations over the final shape of the budget.
Piotr Serafin, the EU's budget commissioner and Poland's main man in Brussels, appears to have lived up to the expectations placed upon him from Warsaw. But the devil's in the detail, and to break down the fresh numbers coming out of Brussels, I am pleased to welcome Marcin Klucznik, Senior Economic Advisor at the Polish Economic Institute, a government-affiliated think tank. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning and hello, everyone.
So, if we are to be precise, this figure of 123 billion euros that is being allocated to Poland as part of the next EU budget is only really that. It's bookmarked and nothing is confirmed. So really, should Poland be celebrating at this stage?
I think it's a quite good headline number for Poland because, of course, if we adjust it for inflation, those numbers aren't really that much higher than they used to be in past years in the past EU budget, of course. But one thing that you need to remember is that a significant share of the EU budget was to do some kind of a reallocation of wealth from the more wealthy to less affluent countries in the European Union. And what has happened over the past 10, 15 or 20 years in the European Union is that countries of the both Poland and the countries of the Central Eastern Europe space have actually increased their relative economic power relative to, let's say, Western countries. So, for instance, if you take the current Poland GDP as percentage of European Union 27, then at current prices it's something like 4.5% of the whole GDP of the European Union, and 10 years ago it was significantly smaller. So if you adjust it for the fact that we are increasingly more wealthy, then this allocation is rather good for us.
So 123 billion euros in nominal terms is about 15% more than what Poland is set to receive under the current budget. So really we're looking at about 100 billion euros. And then one could say that 123 billion euros is just 100 billion euros adjusted for inflation since 2020. So really we're getting the same amount. Would you agree?
In real terms, quite the same. Yes, this is true. Relative to the GDP, it's actually less, but you need to actually adjust for the fact that, generally speaking, those numbers tend to be higher for the countries that are less affluent. So if you correct it for the fact that we are more affluent, then of course it's kind of a good allocation, as I have said. But of course, with Poland actually growing and converging to the Western countries, since we are catching up basically, and the old CEE countries are, we are becoming increasingly less net receivers of the EU funds. So this is definitely a story that is happening here.
So everyone seems to be so excited on social media. A lot of government officials that are currently, I would say leading members of the government, they seem very, very positive about this number that has come up. But as you've explained it to us, it's really not that much of a difference of what we're receiving right now.
This was a kind of a hard compromise, you could say, because one thing you could actually mention was that definitely a story that was could have happened and was in a debate like 1 year ago or so, was that due to the fact that there are some challenges, of course, for the EU budget, and you have to repay the debt that was taken during Next Generation EU, the factual money to be spent in the next EU budget could be actually smaller as percentage of the GDP, because without that increase of the budget that we have currently to something of approximately 1.26% of the European GNI, you could actually have, due to the fact that you need to allocate some part of this money to actually pay the debt, what you would actually receive would be less money to spend. This was kind of a compromise in a sense that on the one hand side we got a quite larger EU budget, not just as much as, let's say, some countries would like to have, but still kind of larger EU budget. On the other hand side, you got this shift toward competitiveness, something that especially the Western EU countries were actually kind of willing to have. And in that very sense, this is kind of a hard compromise.
I think the whole idea is that Poland was expecting a lot less. But anyway, let's bring up a visual where we can see some of our regional neighbors on that list. As we can see here, Poland is actually at the very top of the list, 123 billion euros. But we also see Romania getting 60 billion euros, Hungary at 40 billion euros, the Czech Republic almost 30 billion euros. Do you think that Poland is actually getting favorable treatment? Some countries, as we can see, are getting 15 to 17% more, but others like Hungary, only 10%, and the Czech Republic just about 1% more. What's the story with Poland?
This is to much extent the story about the population, simply because, well, if you actually compare us to, let's say, Hungary, Slovakia, those are small countries. This is to some extent story about the wealth, because if you compare us to Czech Republic are actually the wealthiest country in the CEE space, somewhere in between, let's say, Poland and Germany, like halfway Germany, let's say, from the Polish perspective. So if you actually correct this for both population that is residing in Poland, which we are simply the largest country in the CEE, and the fact that we are kind of still converging somewhere in the middle of on those income lists in the CEE space, then what you actually would see there is that this is kind of a good allocation for Poland from that side, but actually correcting for both population and GDP per capita levels.
Okay. And let's just look into the future. Let's just pretend that budget negotiations have ended. Poland has received 123 billion euros. And let's talk about spending priorities. And obviously, the cohesion funds will play a large role in that. Let's bring up another visual here where we can see public investment in Poland. And as we can see, all the way from 2004, all the way up to 2022, the share of EU funds in public investment has gone up. And perhaps we can say it quite bluntly, Poland has become hooked on EU funds. We can see that half of the money in local and central government funding has been spent on roads, buses, or IT equipment. If cohesion funds were to be diminished, how would Poland cope?
There are two aspects of it. One of them is, of course, the fact that there will be other funds that will be, of course, partially allocated to Poland, but this was not the scope of your question. And the other fact about these cohesion funds is definitely, this is going to be a challenge for local governments and municipalities in Poland, because much of, let's say, Polish local governments got simply really affected at spending cohesion funds. This is to some extent perhaps a space for Polish government and Polish authorities actually to step up to kind of fill those financing gaps. But what you need to remember, on the other hand side, is that public investments in Poland are generally quite high relative to, let's say, our needs and developmental level. And there was additional challenge with spending this money in past years. The challenge was that, on the one hand side, as you have kind of correctly mentioned, we kind of got hooked on this money. But on the other hand side, what was kind of a challenge for Polish local governments to actually do effectively with EU funds was to actually spend them across the years of this whole 8 years of EU budget. Because what we basically got quite oftenly in the Polish economy was that we were actually preparing some plans, financing schemes for 2 or 3 years or so. And then for additional 4 years or so, we're actually spending all that money in a very short period. And this actually have led to some boom and bust cycles in the Polish public investment. So on that hand side, it's definitely a challenge for local governments that will kind of need to simply readjust to new financing conditions. But on the other hand side, if we look at the Polish, let's say, economy and the private corporates, what we are kind of lacking was perhaps these private investments. And on the other hand side, you could actually say that this new EU budget kind of offers a new change to actually build up both private investments and the private sector in Poland. And this was perhaps the sector that is kind of needing those investments and those money a little bit more at the margin, you could say.
Okay. Now I want to move on to the agricultural aspect of this MFF budget. We see that we are looking at 300 billion euros against the backdrop of what is considered to be a record high EU budget, but it sends a signal of disregard for European farmers. We know that the cap will no longer exist in and of itself. It's going to be merged within a broader budget. The EU Commission says that it's safeguarding its farmers. The farmers say that they feel backstabbed. How do we reconcile those two ideas? I mean, Ursula von der Leyen says that agriculture is being strengthened. What are your thoughts on that? How do we reconcile?
This part is definitely a challenge because on the one hand side, of course, there is a talk about rig fencing and not reducing the spending. But if you look at even nominal terms, not even adjusting for inflation, there's over 20% drop in actual spending on nominal terms. So definitely agriculture spending is decreasing. This isn't really a news story in a sense, because if you look at the EU budgets across, let's say, 20 years or so, then this share of money allocated within the EU budget on agriculture was rather diminishing. But the kind of a drop that we have is kind of unprecedented on the level, not the direction of this drop. So there's definitely like a challenge for many countries, not only for Poland, because there were actually voices from even France and the French farmers that this kind of spending is a challenge for them. On the other hand side, one thing that ought to be remembered is that we definitely have kind of a large agriculture sector in both sea space and the European Union. And once again, what we were kind of lacking was those private investments in other parts of the economy. Kind of, R&D sector, universities, competitiveness. So on the those are relative winners, but the farmers are definitely relative losers of this kind of a budget.
Jerzy Wierzbicki, the president of the Polish Association of Beef Cattle, he depicted this in an interesting way, having heard the numbers, and he said that obviously inflation has been something that has been affecting farmers very much. I mean, it's been affecting everybody, but he said that 535 billion euros would be needed to return to 2020 values when it comes to support from the EU. 411 billion euros would be needed to maintain the 2027 value. Obviously, we can see where the EU is heading in terms of its support for the EU. What are farmers supposed to do? What is the EU's vision in terms of support for the agricultural industry? How are farmers supposed to adapt to what is happening?
Unfortunately, the very core of this vision is to support the farmer less. Because what was the part of the common agriculture policy was in a kind of sense this kind of redistribution within the EU to kind of sustain agriculture sector across all EU countries. And this was definitely a story that was within the EU budget and on the European level. But what has started to become an increasingly important challenge for the European Union as a whole was that we don't have much money in the EU budget because it's a little bit over 1% of EU GDP, and those are simply really small money, those are pennies. And if you want to spend on defense, competitiveness, clean transition, anything else than agriculture, then someone needs to be this kind of a relative losers on the budget. So if you are talking about filling this gap on the European level, it's likely not going to happen, simply.
You mentioned earlier that in terms of the money allocated to Poland and also in the EU, R&D science is going to be one of those winners. And obviously for Poland, that's also something that we can focus on. Do you think that Poland can live up to that challenge and actually use that money in a sensible way? We know that we can use that money when it comes to cohesion funds, looking at how regional roads have improved over the years. But what about competitiveness?
This is going to be a challenge in the short term. Definitely, I think that is a challenge generally for Polish science and all this high-tech sector is that it's simply starting to build. And this is a process that usually takes time. We don't have much experience in, let's say, taking funds from EU Horizon. Even if you look at Polish academics and Polish universities, they were always on the bottom of that list. Adjusted for, let's say, population levels. So we don't have that experience, and this is going to be kind of a real challenge in the short term, definitely. But there is a long-term aspect to it. And actually, like two aspects, you could say. One of them is that eventually we need to do, if we want to become like a truly high-income country, not in, this kind of a world-broad perspective, but also within the European Union. And the other hand side is that this money to be reallocated on high-tech industries is actually important on the European level as a whole, because the Polish growth story of, let's say, past 20 or 30 years, and the whole CEE space as well, was the story of economic convergence. There were wealthy Western countries, and we were simply converging, catching up to their economy. This was the story, and this was working quite well for 20, 30 years or so. But these Western countries are actually starting to lag behind. They are lagging behind the United States to some extent, and on some aspects on China. And if they actually don't live to the standard, then actually them lagging behind is actually kind of a glass ceiling for the Polish, Czech, or Romanian's economic growth as well. So on that hand side, I would say that in the long term, we kind of must.
Just very briefly, as we wrap up, what about defense? Poland will have the opportunity to spend more on defense. It's a large part of our focus, a lot of expenditure going there. Do you think Poland can make use of the funds allocated to that?
To some extent, but there's also a challenge of, let's say, defense companies within Western countries that are simply much larger and have much more capabilities to actually utilize those money in the short term. So this is kind of a similar story like education and productivity, research and development. So on the short term, this is going to be a challenge, but if you take the numbers that are going to be spent on defense within the European Union, there's a great potential to build new companies. So in a perspective of, let's say, 10 or 15 years, this is a potential for Poland as well.
Okay, lots of new chapters lie ahead for Poland. Marcin Klucznik, Senior Economic Advisor at the Polish Economic Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. And that concludes the bottom line for today. I was your host, Marie Cato. We bring you the best of regional business Monday to Friday at 5:10 CET on TVP World. And in the meantime, for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. Goodbye.